Okay, we've started.
Hello, and welcome to the latest pep talk from We Are Content Club. Today we have Michelle Keller. Michelle is my favorite Content Club member. She's been a member since day one, and that's no offense to any other members that are on this call, because you're all my favorites. But it's been great watching her grow and develop over the last 2 years, and we've been meaning to ask her to do a talk for quite a wee while. And we're so happy that she said yes to do this month. So I keep forgetting this. Pep Talks are sponsored by Content Design London. They are amazing. If you haven't done any of the training courses or bought any of the books, where have you been? Get onto the website and have a look. And so on that note, I'm going to pass over to you, Michelle. You muted yourself.
Thank you. Now I got it. Sorry, my icons dancing. Thank you. I am excited to be here too, and I'm also a little bit nervous, but I know most of you, so I'm just gonna I'm talking to my friends today. So today I'm going to talk about empathy and compassion as a content designer, and what that looks like and how that plays out in my own practice, and some ways that you can incorporate that into your practice. And hopefully at the end, we'll have a little time to play together. And so without you, if I can, there we go. So this is just a little agenda of where we're going. So I'll talk a little bit about my career path, and then I'll talk a little bit about my own career path, some definitions, and then walk you through some principles that others have used for trauma-informed design, and then some ways that I use those in my practice. Sorry, my computer is really slow. So who am I? I'm a content designer. Tom actually is the one who taught me to say that. And when I first started doing content design, it felt a little scary to call myself a content designer, but now I'm just I live in Virginia in the US at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and that this picture is taken at the very top of the Blue Ridge Mountains at a winery, and that's my husband and my 2 kids. So I am a content designer, but I'm also a mom and I'm a wife, and those things influence the way that I approach content design. So currently I am a content designer without a company. So I worked previously for hospice here in the US, but I was recently laid off due to budget concerns, but I'm still a content manager. And so I'm excited, a content designer. I'm sorry, I think I said that, but I do manage content. I'm still a content designer, and I am still learning and growing even in this off season while I'm looking for the next thing to do. So I'm excited to share with you guys. This has been something I've been wanting to talk about for a while, but needed the motivation to actually put the talk together. So my squiggly career path. How did I get here? So this is a little bit of my user journey. So back in the dark ages, I started as a social worker. That was a really long time ago, but I worked with children who were in state custody because they had been abused or neglected by their families. And so that's where I got my start. And then I took time off from there to go to graduate school in theological studies, which has nothing to do with being in social work or being in content, but that's all right. Then I worked for a startup that was an internship training program, leadership program for students who had just graduated from high school and were kind of taking a gap year between high school and university. Then I actually worked at a university as a registrar, working with student registration and graduation requirements. Then I took a career break because my kiddos were little and I wanted to be home with them. And then I started doing some UX design freelance work, but got tired of the constant hassle for clients. So then I switched into being a content designer for content at hospice. So that's been a really squiggly career, and it's super fun to try and capture that all on a resume, but it wasn't for nothing. I learned a lot. And this list, honestly, I came up with in just like 30 seconds of brainstorming, because all those skills that I learned in other positions that were not content positions have been so helpful in doing content work. everything was so transferable. I can drop into just about any situation and get my bearings pretty quickly, and figure out what I need to get the job done. I'm really resourceful. I've done a lot of work in nonprofits where there's not much of a budget. And so I'm really great at finding tools and resources for free, which all companies love. So I've learned how to interact with all kinds of different people. I've done people facing roles. I've done business facing roles. I'm not scared of a challenge. I can prioritize things really well. So I think squiggly careers bring so many skills into a content design job that I couldn't get any other way. Probably the biggest thing that I've learned in all of my jobs so far is that I really have a commitment to helping people and to making their lives better in whatever my job might be. So whether that's as a social worker or as a mom or as an administrator at a university or as a content designer. Now that I am a content designer, I've really taken that commitment to want to help people, and I've made it the foundation for the way in which I practice content design. And so that's what I want to spend most of our time today talking about. So a few definitions, because I think that's helpful so that we all know what we're talking about, especially since we speak two different levels of English for most of us. So y'all speak the right English and I speak American English. So, but empathy, empathy is what allows us to have relationships with others. It's understanding how other people feel. No one wants to be friends with someone who has no empathy, right? That's a terrible relationship. Having empathy allows us to celebrate with our friends when they get a new job or have a new baby. And it also allows us to commiserate with them when they get laid off or when they have a relationship end. So as content designers, that empathy is what enables us to understand our users so that we can feel what they're feeling and know what they're experiencing. And then we can design content that speaks to that need. Compassion takes it one step further from empathy. We don't just understand the feelings that people are feeling, whether that's anger or sadness or anxiety. We understand it, but then we also want to do something to make it better. So compassion is the thing that moves us to action, to doing something. So we buy a pint for our friend who got laid off, or we send them a job posting, but we do something to act upon that empathy that we're feeling. And I personally, when I take those two pieces together, empathy and compassion, that's when I end up with trauma-informed design. So thinking about how do I practice compassionate design might feel a little tricky, because when I worked in hospice, for example, the best content in the world is not going to take away the pain of someone's grief. When your loved one dies, you are going to grieve. I can write the best piece of content that anyone has ever seen, and you're still going to grieve. So not every stressful situation can be alleviated by good content. But I do think that there are principles that we can incorporate into our content design that we can practice regularly that will prevent us from doing more harm with our content, and that can help our users to flourish in spite of the stress or anxiety or grief that they're encountering. And that's where the trauma-informed design comes in. So a brief note about trauma, which could be its own talk. So there's lots of great resources. I've been to several talks. So if you're interested in a talk specifically on trauma, hit me up later and I can get you some information. But the key thing that I want you to remember as we're talking about trauma is that it's not just an event that happens to you. It's the way in which you respond to the things that happen or don't happen. Because something that's traumatic for me might not be traumatic for you. And so I think that makes it a little harder to quantify. How do I know if someone has experienced trauma when they're coming to my website? I don't know. Which is why I think it's important for every content designer to think about what a trauma-informed practice would look like for them. Not just for those of us who work in trauma fields like hospice or with veterans, but for anyone. So let's take an example. Let's say I work for a bank. We're working on a new app experience for transferring money between your accounts, let's say, from taking money out of your savings account into your checking account, because some people still write checks. And that doesn't feel super traumatic, right? You're like, easy peasy. But let's say that you just found out that your partner got made redundant. And the week before you moved into a new house and you have a large payment that's due. you know that you're going to have to dip into your savings account in order to make that payment. So you open up your banking app to transfer money from your savings account into your checking account so you can pay the bill. Now, does it feel a little bit more like a traumatic situation? Yeah, it's completely different now. Sometimes a banking app isn't just a banking app. And since we don't know what situation our users are in when they're coming to our content, it just makes sense to take a compassionate approach to design and incorporate trauma-informed design principles in what we do. So where does trauma-informed design come from? If you're not familiar with the concept of trauma-informed design, I actually would point you to Rachel's talk. I know you're on the call, Rachel, but Rachel did a talk for content folks on trauma-informed design practice, and I would highly recommend that to you guys. It's great. But I'm going to look at kind of the principles that underlie trauma-informed design and then how we can incorporate those to our specific context. So we're going to look at three groups of people, SAMHSA, Chen, and Pause and Effect, to look at their principles and how they use them in the work they do. SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and it's a U.S. government agency in our Department of Health and Human Services. And they are kind of the ones who are usually credited with being the first ones to publish principles for being trauma-informed. Now, it wasn't trauma-informed design. They were just talking about a trauma-informed practice. So not necessarily looking at digital or even content at all. And they were looking specifically at folks with the substance abuse issue or with mental health concerns. And so they weren't really thinking about content design, but I think that these principles are a good jumping off point for where we are. So they have 6 of them. The first one is safety. And when they talk about safety, they're actually talking about physical safety, in a room where they might have a counseling session or where people gather for a group, and also safety with interpersonal relationships and how we talk to one another. Trustworthiness and transparency was very important to them. They want to make sure that everything that they do is conducted openly before the users who come in. They want to practice respect and fairness because those things build trust. And you want your users to trust you. Their third component, which is the one that I honestly don't deal a ton with, is peer support. And that is taking the folks who have lived experience and allowing them to get support from others who share that lived experience. So I think there are ways to think about that for design, but it makes a lot more sense when you're working in a physical location where you're having people actually gather. And so providing that support from others who have the same lived experience that they do. Next is collaboration and mutuality. And that's partnering with your clients and your users and partnering with your staff together, that this isn't a single person activity. Now, if you're a solo designer, you might say, but it kind of is, Michelle. Well, I was a solo designer, but I can still collaborate with my users, and I can collaborate with other people at my agency. They might just not be in the same field that I am, but they might have a different perspective. So being able to work together as a group and not just kind of being on your own. The next one is empowerment, voice, and choice. And that's making sure that we're actually listening to the people that we're serving, that their strengths and their experiences need to be recognized and built upon, that we need to make sure that we're kind of leveling the playing field so that it's not, I'm the great content designer and I will fix all of your problems. That takes away their voice and their choice. And then the last one that they talk about is cultural, historical, and gender issues. And that's looking beyond just the single person and the systems that they're part of, because those systems influence not only the trauma that they've experienced, but how they're going to interact with your service. For example, in healthcare, it's well documented in the United States that folks who are Black and Hispanic have a higher level of distrust in healthcare organizations than folks who are white. So they're already coming to my healthcare service with a predisposition not to trust me. So the way in which I interact with them needs to recognize that and be more intentional about trust. My guess is that most of those concepts are not new to you, that you may not have labeled them as that when you're working on your content design, but I bet that you're doing what you can to incorporate them. So keep those in mind as we look at two other organizations. CHEN is an organization that works with victims of gender-based violence. And I went to a training that they did several months ago where they took those 6 principles from SAMHSA and they adapted them for their own specific context. And so they came up with 8 principles. And you'll notice that there's a lot of overlap between these and CHEN, or sorry, these and SAMHSA. Take a breath, Michelle. So their first principle is also safety. And they maintain that safety should be the default, not an add-on, that everything that we do should focus on making sure that our users feel safe. Now, I can't guarantee that someone feels safe, especially because I'm only interacting with them through a screen most of the time. There are things I can put in place to help them to feel safe. So for example, CHEN has an exit now button on their website because again, they're working with folks who are survivors of gender-based violence. So if I'm looking at resources about how to get help and the person who has been abusing me walks in the room, I need to be able to get off that site fast. And I need to not have it stored in my browser for them to find it. So CHEN works to do that. When I worked in hospice, we knew that folks would be reading our content and encountering that in a state where they were very stressed and very anxious. And so we had a button on every page that took them to crisis resources where they could call a hotline right away if they experienced distress, or that they could contact their local office. We had a button on every page where they could do that. So CHEN really focuses on that, looking at things like colors and the images that are on your site as well. Are those images that are going to cause distress to people? You don't want to put on a gender-based violence website, don't put pictures of abuse on the site. That's obviously going to be cause significant distress for people. And watch the colors that you use. You want to create a place that feels safe and not jarring. And that can be different depending on what culture you're designing into, which makes it significantly more complicated. But they also talk about safety in the sense of user research interviews when you're doing those, making sure that safety, not just for the participant, but also for the researcher, that you don't do sessions by yourself. If you're dealing with difficult subjects, you have someone else there with you. You have hotlines available. I was speaking with someone the other day who works with veterans, and she said they actually have the hotline number for the suicide hotline with them in the session, and they've actually had to stop sessions and call for the veteran that they're talking with at the time. So it's thinking about those things in advance are ways to promote safety. Agency is CHEN's next pillar. That with gender-based violence in particular, victims lose their power and control. That choice has been taken away from them by their abuser. And so it's doubly important in the content then that we honor that agency, that we ask for consent. We don't share details that people don't want shared. We let them have a chance to say how they want information shared, how they want to receive information. We provide them multiple pathways to support. I was just on the unemployment website last week trying to fix an issue in my particular state, and there was one phone number to call if you needed assistance. There were no emails. There was 1-800 number to call that had, I'm not kidding you, a 20-minute phone tree that I had to go through. And then they asked me for information that I did not have and hung up on me. So that doesn't protect my agency. I didn't have any choice. I have to call this number. So now I have to go to the office. But find multiple ways for people to contact you, whether that's a chat bot or whether that's an email, or whether it's a phone number. Give them choices. Equity. All of the design that CHEN does, they want to center on inclusivity and accessibility. Different survivors need different types of support, and they want to make sure that nobody gets left out. So there are a number of trainings on being inclusive and accessible, so I'm not going to try and unpack all of that here. I'm doing a great one that Eddie Bailey King is doing, so I highly recommend that. It's called Strong Words, maybe? I don't remember, but it's fantastic. So being mindful of being inclusive and accessible in the way that your site is laid out, the colors that you use, the language that you use, all of those things need to make sure that everyone feels welcome when they come to your site. Privacy, obviously for gender-based violence folks, that is a huge deal. Nothing's been private to them. And the process that you have to go through is so violating most of the time. But privacy is viewed as a fundamental right. Everyone has a right to privacy. That means my data needs to be secure and I need to know how you're using my data. So make that clear to your users when they come to your site. What are you doing with their data? How long do you keep it? If they don't want you to keep it, how can they tell you that they don't want you to do that? And don't ask for information that you don't need. Be mindful when you're making forms or when you're asking them for things. Only ask for what you need. Accountability, being transparent about what, why, and how you're doing things. Creating feedback loops that will actually result in a change. Communicating openly, clearly, consistency with your users is so important. You're making it for them, so be accountable to them when you're doing it. Plurality, don't assume that you know what a user might want or need. How many times do we hear that? All the time, right? It's part of being trauma informed. Don't assume. Don't assume a one size fits all approach, right? That everybody who comes to my website is going to interact with my service in this way. They might not. So value the unique lived experiences of those who are using the service or using your product. Sharing power. Again, this isn't me solving your problems. This is us doing it together. So Chen emphasizes co-design and co-creating with the communities that are affected. They actually do a ton of work with volunteers in order to help make that happen. And they have an actual code of conduct for their volunteers. It's a really well thought out process. I would recommend checking out their website. And then my favorite one that they have is hope. That's their last pillar in the way that they look at design. They want all of the interventions that they have available to users to be an oasis for them, that they would find it to be empathetic and warm and soothing, and they want to offer hope for healing. And that might feel weird if you work on a banking app, right? But money is one of the number one stressors for people. So can you present your financial information in a way that offers hope to people who might feel confused about money or might feel like they don't have any money? So how can you have a positive direction in the content that you are designing? So that's 10. Another group that has done a lot of work with this is called Pause and Effect. And they're a collective of folks who have a shared vision for relationship-based design practices. They do trainings and consultations on how to do research and design in such a way that it promotes relationality and developing relationships. And they look at design as a way to bring liberation and regeneration for groups that have often been marginalized and oppressed. So their first pillar is joy and pleasure, that they believe that design can create a space for the presence of joy. I know there's been some controversy over that, and I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm just kind of outlining what their principles are. So I think you can lean that into the hope section. So interconnectedness, recognizing that our connection to each other, our connection with the land that we live on, and our connection with kind of the ecosystem that's around us, and taking all of that into account when we're designing content. So it's not just human design. I think thinking through things like AI and how unsustainable that is environmentally. Thinking about things like PDFs, which are also not super sustainable from an environmental standpoint. So all that's part of the interconnectedness, that we're not just humans who live in a void, right? That we're part of a larger ecosystem. Intergenerational looks at relationships with people across time, space, and place. That I don't just operate in my little office here in Virginia, right? I interact with you guys. I'm part of the family that I grew up in. So looking at that broader system that we're part of too. And again, we see agency and choice, right? Meeting people where they're at, respecting them, honoring their right to self-determination, and thinking through that as we make our content and as we design it. How can I protect their agency and their choice? Dignity, I love that. Affirming people's worthiness of respect and the right to wholeness of the human experience. Does our content celebrate the dignity of the people who are using it, or does it shame them? I mean, I love the Amazon Prime quit process, which is horrific if you've ever done it. It's like, let me go through 3 screens where you tell me that I'm a horrible human being because I want to cancel my service. I will say the US just passed a law now that companies have to make it just as easy to cancel as they do to sign up. So Amazon's probably scrambling right now. But protect their dignity as they're using your service or using your product. Systemic, again, that goes back to the understanding the systems that feed into the trauma. Even if those systems don't really affect the service that you're providing, the person who's using it has been affected by those systems and they're bringing that with them. So we need to be mindful of that. And then their last one is relational responsibility, acknowledging our own positionality and then practicing repair where there's rupture, and being accountable for that. So when who just did an ad? I'm not going to remember. I should look that up ahead of time. I was watching an ad earlier just today, and it has 3 Black families doing things growing up. The baby's walking, they're getting married, then they're starting a new business. And then the last episode, it's for a security company. The last image in the ad series has a family that has a break-in in their home and their security system keeps them safe. That family's white. Why? Why did they change it? Because in America, only Black people break into homes. So the family that gets broken into has to be white. Now, I don't know that they deliberately thought of that when they made the ad, but that's someone not recognizing their own positionality in that. Make the family Black. Anyway, that was a sidebar. That's not in my notes. So hopefully you're beginning to see that there's a lot of overlap in what all 3 of these agencies are using. And you might be thinking, that's great, Michelle, but I don't work in anything that's even remotely related to a trauma-informed field. What does that look like on my intranet for my company? Or what does that look like on my local council website, or my banking app, or my shopping app? How do we take those principles and make them work in our own practice? I think if we look at it not, I have to be trauma-informed, but if we think of it back to the very beginning, to empathy and compassion, we can all bring that to whatever service or product that we're working on. So I'm going to take you through my process a little bit. I came up with 4 because I can't remember 8 principles. It's too many. So I have 4 principles. I started with SAMHSA. I pulled in Chen and Pause and Effect and a couple of other things. And this is what I came up with. So my passion is to create content that promotes trust, protects the agency and dignity of our clients, is welcoming to all by being inclusive and accessible, and offers hope for the future. I can use that in whatever field I end up getting a job in. That's how I want to create content. So my principles are trust, agency, welcome, and hope. And what I did was a little affinity mapping. You probably can't read all those tiny little Post-it notes because this is a screenshot because I lost access to my Miro account. But this is a screenshot, and we're going to play with one later where you'll be able to read them all. But what I did, the purple Post-it notes are the SAMHSA principles. The pink ones are from Chen. The blue ones are from Pause and Effect. And then I read a book from Eva Penzi-Moog called Design for Safety, which is amazing, and I highly recommend it. And I had a few notes from that, so those are in yellow. And then in this little greenish, bluish color, were some principles from my own bereavement practice at hospice. And so I just threw all those things on Post-its, and then I moved them around and I made some connections between them. And then I realized, oh, I can sort these into 4 sweet little areas. And there were my principles for design. And I'm not gonna lie, it was super fun. I love Post-it notes. I'm a sucker for Post-it notes. So if you're trying to figure out what should I do in my own practice, how can I pull these ideas of empathy and compassion in, I would recommend doing something like this. And we're going to just do it later. But I want to walk you through kind of what I landed on and why I landed on what it looks like. So for me, trust is the first principle. I have to start there because if our users don't trust us, no content and design in the world is going to help them. They need to trust me. So safety and transparency help build that trust, like the exit now button that I talked about, or the crisis button that I talked about. We also don't assume consent. Ask for it early, ask for it often. Pop-ups are annoying, right? We all hate them. But you know what else I hate? The little banner on the bottom of the screen that says, by using this site, you consent to all of our cookies. No, that's not informed consent. That's not trustworthy. I should be able to consent to whatever cookies I want or don't want. I should be able to consent to whatever information I want you to use and what I don't want you to use. I want my data protected, and if that means I don't want you to store it, I ought to have the option to choose that. So be transparent about what you're doing with data. Be transparent about what you're asking for and why. Again, don't ask for information just because you can. Do you really need to know your user's gender? You might not. I know you think you do, but why? Why do you need to know? Why do you need their street address and their phone? I've just been filling out a bazillion job applications, and I can't tell you how many times they ask me for the county in which I live. These are for remote positions. Why do you care what county I live in? But there's no explanation. I just have to put it on form. So tell users why you're asking for the information you're asking for and give them options. Tell them clearly and plainly what you're doing with their data. Things like layout and design, standardization and word use, your sentence structure, all of those things help to build trust because the users know what to expect. They don't have to try and read between the lines and figure out what you're saying because you're speaking clearly and plainly to them. They don't have to radically adjust to different page layouts every time they click a button on the page. There's consistency. The reality is that even if I try and do all those things, I'm going to get it wrong sometimes because we're human and we do make mistakes. But mistakes don't have to destroy trust. When you make a mistake, fix it. If you get feedback from a user that says this thing was not helpful, then get all the information you can on it and fix it. And then tell your users that you made adjustments based on their feedback. It's a phenomenal way to build trust with your users. Hey, we noticed that a bunch of you made a comment that this particular page wasn't helpful, and so we've made these changes to it. Thank you for telling us that this wasn't helpful. Those are fantastic ways to build trust with your users. So second is agency. One of the biggest ways that we can build agency into our content is to involve our users. Doing user research, code design, feedback surveys, usability studies, anything that you can do to help talk to your users and help you understand what they need, what they want, what is helpful, what isn't helpful, and then taking that information and building it into the content that we design. I know it can be hard if you don't have a budget for user research. I didn't at my previous company, but I did it anyway. Optimal Research has a small free plan that you can use and do a couple of studies on, and I did some card sorts there. You can always post something on social media and say, hey, I'm looking for some folks who might be willing to talk to me about X, and then talk to them. Is it the best research that you can do? No. Is it better than no research? I think so. Someone actually said to me, read Reddit subthreads because people share very freely about experiences on a number of different things there. So do whatever you can to talk to users and get information from actual users. Another way to protect their agency is to give them choices on our site, real choices, but not too many choices. I don't need to choose my color scheme on every page. I don't need to, that's too many choices that don't matter. But a choice of what to do with my data, that's a choice I need. A choice in my onboarding. If you have 10 screens in your onboarding screen for your app, and I only have time and energy to do 2 of them today, can I pick up with step 3 when I come back, or do I have to start the whole process all over again? Think about choices like that. Those are real choices for users. So we need to learn to listen to our users and understand what they're saying and what they're not saying. And so remember way back to my squiggly career path, most of the non-content jobs that I had were up close and personal with real life human beings. I had to learn to listen to them and to understand. And those soft skills have been invaluable to me as a content designer. So listen to them, protect their agency, and don't overwhelm them with too many choices. Welcome. So we need to look seriously about how the issue of identity affects our response to trauma. So our identity is multifaceted. It includes things like personal history, culture, race, gender, ethnicity, a host of other variables. And it would be impossible for me to design every piece of content to include all the possible variables that would affect every individual user's identity, right? That's a little overwhelming, but we can look for ways to welcome in some way all of our users. And I think the first way to do that is through accessibility. Clear language, solid information architecture, alt text, appropriate color choices, and simple layouts all serve to make our sites more accessible. And sites that are accessible benefit everyone. Nobody gets left behind. It can be challenging, I think, sometimes to make our content and our design equitable and inclusive. I think the tendency can sometimes be to have segmented user journeys for every identity, but I don't think that actually promotes inclusivity, because the segmentation itself reinforces the idea that some communities are other, right? And I don't want any of my users to feel like they're other. I don't want them to feel lost or excluded or on the outside when they come to my content. So I need to think about the words that I'm using and the pictures, the images that I'm showing. How can I reflect the beauty of diversity without the harshness of that segmentation so that they feel welcome? And then my last principle is also hope. Because when we work towards trust, agency, and welcome, we create an environment where hope can grow. And when hope grows, our users thrive. And that's my ultimate goal. It isn't site visits or revenue generated or reviews left. I mean, those things are helpful and they are important. But the reason that I do what I do is to make life better for my users. And here's the thing, when I do that, site visits go up, revenue generated goes up, reviews are positive. All of those things happen when my focus is on making life better for my users. I read a book online from Jeremy Cherry, who is a designer here in Charlottesville, and it's called Designing Hope. I'll drop a link into the chat because it's available for free online. And he has 3 principles for incorporating hope into your design practice. Be curious, learn from your surroundings, be compassionate, form solutions from experiential learning, and be humble, share responsibility. When we approach content design in that way, with a compassionate, humble curiosity, then we can design content in such a way that all our users benefit. And that's why I do what I do. So, do we have time to do a little Miro board wrapping while people are asking questions? Can that work?
Totally.
Great. I'm going to put this link in the chat, hopefully. So this is it's not pasted in my link. Go ahead and ask your questions while I figure this out.
Does anybody have any questions? I guess I've got a question for you, Michelle. A lot of the stuff you were talking about there should be general practice of any content designer. And I do sometimes think the phrase trauma-informed scares people.
I would agree with that. Do you have a question?
No, that's just, there's a statement that you could comment on if you want.
I think you're right, which is why I left the talk entitled Compassion and Empathy. Because for me, I think that trauma-informed is the natural outworking of practicing compassionate design. And talking about compassion and empathy, I don't think is scary for people. The content designers that I know are honestly among some of the most compassionate people that I've ever met. And so when I say, look, I want to have empathy, I want to understand how my users feel, and I want to be moved to do something about it, that's compassion. When I put those 2 things together, that is trauma. Just call it empathetic and compassionate. Compassionate design is easier. So Yeah, I think you're right. I think people hear trauma-informed design and they think that that is only for, oh yeah, Michelle, you worked in death. That's for sure trauma. Or you work with veterans, or you work with gender-based violence survivors. Yeah, those people need to deal with trauma because trauma feels scary. The reality is that people are coming to your site and they've experienced trauma. It may have nothing to do with your site. Maybe they just ran out to get the mail and they saw a car accident. And they're coming to finish whatever they started. They're looking at a recipe, right? But if our content is compassionate and we approach it with empathy, you shouldn't need an account for Miro, I don't think, Cal. It's supposed to be anybody who clicks that link can access the board. Has anybody tried that? I'm going to share my Miro. You should be able to access it. Wow. And what I've done on that little Miro board is I have the principles from Samson and Chen and cause and effect on there. And then there's green post-it notes. Oh, I see people on the board. There's green post-it notes that you can write your own. If your company, for example, says, we want to talk about service to others. So put service to others on a green post-it note. And then you can drag stuff over to the empty space that's labeled group, and you guys can group them. You can also make a copy of that Miro board, and then you could use it with your own group in your own practice. Cal, were you able to get on, or did it make you?
It's making me log in or set a password, but unfortunately, we're not allowed to use Miro. We're not allowed Miro accounts in my organisation, so I'll just sit and watch everyone go along. It's absolutely fine. Don't worry about it.
You can watch everybody else play.
Absolutely.
About that, I didn't check that. Tom, did that answer your question and your thought?
Yeah. I just want to make sure. I guess I just wanted to make sure I wasn't totally misguided. Does anybody else have a question for Michelle?
It's not really a question, but it's kind of just a point to make, really. I don't know, because I don't want to, like Michelle, give you the pressure of answering this, but something that kind of came up when you were talking about it that I think like probably as content designers we need to be aware of is that challenge of so I do work in an organization where we deal with a lot of content where this is really appropriate, and we deal with a lot of heavy subjects that can be where we're at risk potentially of re-traumatizing people. And I'm very lucky to work with a lot of people who are almost like the frontline practitioners of delivering the services to those users. But having said that, they don't necessarily always know in content itself how to do that in a compassionate and empathetic way. Like, you still need that content design approach, but there's that the slight tug, I think, of they're the experts in terms of this kind of practice, but you're trying to go in and say, actually, I think you should probably be thinking about framing this differently. Or I think it's just something that I find quite interesting, that I think is one of those challenges. I don't know if that's something you came across when you were working in the hospice, is how, it's like respecting people's expertise. And I guess that's always a challenge as a content designer, isn't it? But that there is this, you absolutely have a huge role to play as a content designer in doing that effectively. But you can be also dealing with some very, very experienced practitioners who have a huge amount of experience in this space. And I think that's something I probably struggle with, is that there's a little bit of a tug of war over who has the final say on how we say these things to people.
I think actually this exercise might be something that would be really helpful to do with them. Emma, I saw that you were focusing on signing up to do. So the idea is to take these principles that other organizations have about trauma design or compassion design and make your own. Like, as a team, this is what we want to be about when we write content. And so that could be an opportunity to pull in these experts and say, because they're probably familiar with some of these principles in these other agencies and say, they've worked to come up with a way to use this and this, and I'm grateful for expertise. Thought maybe we could work together to put some skills that define the way that to use this content in the way that you want to interact with them. And then it becomes something that you guys do together and that you own as a team. And then when there's conflict, you can come back to the principals and say, look, one of our principals, for example, in my previous job, I wanted to change some of the color schemes because they weren't accessible. But they were tied to them because they were colors. And so I was able to say, look, one of our principles is welcome. We want to be inclusive and we want to be accessible. But these color choices that we're using are not accessible. That folks, particularly folks who have low vision or have cataracts or have glaucoma, a number of our users are elderly, they can't read the links or the buttons on our site. And so because I tied it back to a principle that we had agreed on as a team, then my marketing folks were able to say, oh, well, it doesn't do us any good to use brand colors if nobody can read them. And so we were able to then work with that. And I think that would work too with folks who are the trauma practitioners to be able to say, look, one of our principles is that we want to offer hope. But all of this content is written in such a way that will really defeat us, or the pictures that we're using are really sad. And so to be able to come together with some principles that you agree on together and then back your questions to that and using those as ways to shape the practice. I was really fortunate. The folks that I worked with in bereavement were so inviting to share with me their knowledge, and then I was able to, we would do content grips together, and they would say, could you say it this way? And I would say, I could, here's why I said it this way. And so we were able to have conversations about that. Yeah, being able to say why we choose things and tying it back to principles that we've all agreed on has been helpful. Somebody asked a question here in the chat, Mary. How do you work with users who are still living with their abusers, for example, with user interviews? That's a great question. And one of the things that Shen does is they make interviews available virtually. You don't have to do them in person. And they have an escape button even on the interview. So that if they ask you, is this a good time? One of the things they talk about in scheduling interviews is that particularly when working with that population, that you need to be prepared that they're going to cancel. Because they may have made plans to be able to be in a place where they could talk to you online, and then their abuser comes on and now they can't. And they're not going to contact you to tell you that they're canceling. So just being aware of that ahead of time, asking repeatedly through the interview if they're still in a safe place, or having a code word that they can say, like, oh, I need to go get some pineapple. Those types of things to set it up, recognizing that you may have to end the interview suddenly. So doing virtual ones in addition to in-person ones can be ways to work around that, and sending them the interview questions ahead of time so that they have opportunity to prepare makes it less traumatic for them. Does that help, Erin?
It does. Thank you very much.
I see a couple people are asking about the little activity. So my idea was that you could write your own little thoughts on these green post-it notes down here. And then you can drag them over to this space, which isn't green. And then you can group them in ways that make sense to you. You can also copy the board if you want to do it with your team. As a way to just say, hey, I want to take all of these principles and come up with things that make sense to me. And maybe there's one that's on a post-it note that you think is so important that needs to be its own category. That's totally fine. So this is just a process that I went through to come up with my 4 principles, and it's something that I think is pretty transferable to other contexts. And I thought it might be a fun way for us to envision ourselves over the next questions.
Mary's asked another question, Michelle. How do you recruit users sensitively for you are for services that involve abuse or death?
I did a screener survey when I did them, and I had a disclaimer at the very beginning before I showed any of the questions saying that this survey deals with sensitive questions surrounding the death of someone that you loved. If you're willing to talk about that, click this button, then you go to the survey. And then I asked them some more questions because I needed people specifically who had a relative die in hospice care. And so I didn't ask all that information up front. I didn't ask it until later. And so I think you have to be very sensitive. Actually, I'm in a Slack group. I think it might be my healthcare Slack group. And someone was looking for research participants there. And so he just dropped a survey in the chat and said, hey, I need some folks who can do a survey. It'll only take 5 minutes. Click this link. And when you clicked on the link, it immediately asked you about 5 or 6 questions about whether you've ever been sexually abused. And I was like, whoa, dude, you cannot do that. You need to tell people that this is of a sensitive nature. Let them know what you're going to ask questions about. And then if they want to see the questions, then you give them a link. And then you can ask a few questions just to make sure that they're comfortable doing the study. And so I had people who abandoned the survey, whether because they didn't want to talk about death or maybe they just do it or whatever. But if people went through the whole survey, the last question on there was, would you feel comfortable talking more at length? Yes, progressive disclosure. That's a much shorter way of saying it. Yeah, so giving them a little bit of a warning at the beginning of what it's about, and then asking them a few generic questions, and then doing a follow-up if they say that they're willing to talk more. It's very challenging, and those screener surveys I would definitely have other people look at to make sure that you're asking those questions in as gentle a way as possible, because it is difficult to recruit users in those areas. Yeah, great question.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Happy to chat offline too.
That's been amazing, Michelle. My head's burning with information.
I'm also
And,
slide deck too, if people find that would find.
say that again. Sorry, I missed that.
Share my slide deck too, if that would be helpful. So
Yes.
yeah.
We can we'll share it in the club, but also if you send it to us, we'll put it on the when we share it on YouTube.
Perfect. Great.
Thank you, everybody. And we'll be making an announcement for the next pep talk in the next week or so, which is also going to be fantastic.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Michelle. It was brilliant. So interesting. Lots to think about.
Thank you. It's so fun to see people I know on the call. So, yay.